I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. It's my pleasure to be talking tonight about my new book, but especially about Joshua Chamberlain. I guess I could consider him a long ago neighbor of mine. I grew up the street, Chamberlain Street, not too far from where he did, whatever that's worth, I should say. But I do write the Maine at War blog, which is published every Wednesday. I also have the Maine at War Facebook page, and I've written several books, two now about the Civil War and others based on Maine history. Let's get right to the war and the general. It's Saturday, June 18th, 1864. Outside Petersburg, it's hot. The weather's been dry. There's a pretty serious lack of water in places. Joshua Chamberlain, still a colonel, he commands the 1st Brigade, 1st Division of 5th Corps, which is commanded by Governor K. Warren, the statue atop Little Round Top. And the 5th Corps has arrived, marched down almost to the full left of the Army of the Potomac. And as Chamberlain and his brigade are just basically positioning themselves, the Confederate battery comes out from the main defenses, pulls up on a hill and opens fire. Chamberlain receives orders, capture the battery. He maneuvers his brigade. And as his men emerge from the woods to try to successfully complete their mission, one of the guns is swung around, the shell's fired, and Chamberlain makes a note that every one of my staff, including himself, is knocked down and wounds his horse, Charlemagne. The Confederates limber up and withdraw to their main defenses. In this map here, which is one of the maps in my book, Chamberlain's brigade is the one that's fully outlined on the right in blue. He has 5 regiments at this time, 6 regiments, excuse me, including the brand new 187th Pennsylvania. They dig in on the hill. He has his men create lunettes, which are basically artillery emplacements for the Union batteries that are brought up to support his brigade, just in case there's a Confederate counterattack. Between Chamberlain's hilltop position and the Confederate defenses, which are outlined in red, there flows a creek that's called Taylor Creek or Poor's Creek. Chamberlain figures his men have done enough. There's really not much else that they can do on this particular day. But then a staff officer rides up with an order for Chamberlain to take his brigade down over the hill and attack the main Confederate defenses, which Chamberlain can clearly see. The artillery embrasures. He knows the infantry is always there wherever the artillery is. He questions the attack in a written note. The order is reconfirmed. Chamberlain is promised support. So he sets a time of 3 p.m. to launch his assault. This is also the same day that the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery will be launched into an unsupported attack further to the right and will essentially be wiped out. So it's a bad day for people from Maine, at least outside Petersburg. Chamberlain attacks at 3 o'clock. His men go down the hill, approaching what he suddenly realizes what is bad ground, swampy and boggy. Chamberlain, who's moving with his men, he's on foot, not on his horse. He sees drier terrain nearby, so he raises his brigade flag and he signals with his sword to the left, and his men incline that way. All of a sudden, thunk! Bullet strikes Chamberlain 2 inches below his right hip socket, punches through his groin, just creases his bladder, nicks his urethra, and punches out through his left hip, but gets caught in a pocket of skin. He first notices, beyond the pain, that his right cavalry boot, the blood is pouring out of it. He goes down ultimately to his knees, then essentially on his face. He figures he's dying. What happens is that John Bigelow, the commander of the 9th Massachusetts Battery, which sacrificed itself at the Trussell Farm in Gettysburg on July 2nd, 1863, he hears, as the infantry attack is repelled, that Chamberlain is down, has been shot. He sends men down to find Chamberlain, and they evacuate him on a blanket, bring him up, put him into an ambulance, and he's carted across country in one of those bone crunching rides that ambulances were well known for, to a hospital about 3 miles behind the lines. The surgeons examine his wound. They're quite fascinated by the pocket on his left hip where that bullet is. They cut the bullet out of him. They're quite excited about that. But they tell the colonel that you're not going to live till morning. Chamberlain realizes that, yes, I'm mortally wounded. So he writes a last letter by lamplight, basically with a pencil and paper, to my darling wife. That would be Frances or Fanny Adams, whom we had married years earlier. And I would wonder, as Chamberlain's lying there, does he think, how did it all come to this? By Maine standards in midsummer 1862, Joshua Chamberlain's got it all. He is a full-time professor at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, which means his position is secure. He's married to the pretty, talented, and stylish Frances Fanny Adams. She's originally from Massachusetts. She was raised in Brunswick by her uncle, blood uncle, I should say, and each of his 2 wives. But she's more or less what we consider to be a Mainer. Mainers being sometimes a little bit protective of people that move here from out of state. That's just the way they are up here. I hope no one's offended. And they've already had 4 children. A daughter, Grace Dupee, and a son, Harold Willis, have survived. The other 2 children died young. Actually, one little boy died basically of stillbirth, and they've both been buried at the family plot in a little cemetery in the backside of Bowdoin College. Chamberlain's in his early 30s. Again, he's married, has 2 children. He has no reason to enlist. The draft does not want him, and he would be considered a last-ditch candidate for the draft in 1863. But for him, it's not enough. We have to ask why. It's the war. Chamberlain, for over 12 months now, has watched Bowdoin College graduates and Bowdoin College students leave for the war front. They've gone and joined various units from Maine or other states. And he is feeling the pressure internally. He is a man that's driven by internal pressures to do his duty. So he writes to Maine Governor Israel Washburn Jr. He's the gentleman on the left. He's about 5'3", 5'5", and offers his services, hopefully in one of the infantry regiments that the state of Maine is raising that summer. The state has been told by the War Department to come up with regiments 16, 17, 18, and 19. That would require 4,000 recruits. About 5,000 men sign up in what will be the last patriotic outburst from Maine that will result in such an extensive recruiting effort. So Washburn creates the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment. He gives his colonelcy to Adelbert Ames, who's on the right here, a native of Maine who was a West Point graduate, and he fought at First Manassas with a Federal artillery battery. Although wounded badly during the battle, Ames stuck with his guns, and he will earn the Medal of Honor in the future for his efforts to that particular day. Washburn makes Chamberlain, who is a pure civilian at heart, lieutenant colonel. What happens is that Ames, when he meets his regiment, where it's mustered outside Portland, is shocked by the independent-minded civilian Yankees that he encounters, but he finds something special in Chamberlain. He sees a potential there that remains a little bit ill-defined. And Chamberlain takes a shine to Ames. He realizes that his colonel can teach him how to be an officer and teach him how to be a warrior. 20th Maine ships off to Washington, D.C., and actually arrives at Sharpsburg, Maryland, in time to guard what's called the Middle Bridge over Antietam Creek on September 17th, 1862. The regiment is not involved in the fighting, suffers no casualties. The next day, Chamberlain and Ames take the regiment across the Burnside Bridge. So you've been to Antietam battlefield and walk back and forth on that bridge. The 20th Maine and Joshua Chamberlain crossed over. It's the first war scene that you can say is affiliated with Joshua Chamberlain. A day or two later, George McClellan pushes a strong reconnaissance force across the Potomac River at Shepherdstown, Virginia. You can see in the picture on the right, we're looking at the Shepherdstown shore. The logs in the river are called Boteller's Dam. This was one of the places the Union troops crossed both ways. The 20th Maine goes over, but Confederate troops come up, push the Yankees back, and Chamberlain, who was given a magnificent stallion by the residents of Brunswick before he left the war, borrows another horse, so his horse, Prince, does not get hurt. During the retreat, Chamberlain discovers a big hole in the floor of the Potomac River, so he and his horse become a navigational marker, and he's steering the troops around the hole. Unfortunately, his board horse gets shot. Chamberlain does not clearly tell us what happened to it, but he does say that he had to wade ashore himself. The Army does pursue Robert E. Lee into central Virginia, arrives at Stafford County, opposite Fredericksburg on the Rappahannock River. In November, Ambrose Burnside, who has replaced McClellan, has a good idea for attacking Fredericksburg. Unfortunately, he decides to wait for the pontoon boats that arrive late. And by the time they get to Stafford County, Robert E. Lee and his army are dug in along Maurice Heights behind the city, then down across Howison Hill, Prospect Hill, and the other high ground southwest of the city. Burnside can see, as can any experienced officer, that to attack Maurice Heights up about a half mile up behind downtown Fredericksburg is suicide. You can see the artillery on the heights. You can see the infantry, which is actually Mississippians, spread along the sunken road about halfway down beneath the heights, and they're protected by stone wall. The wall's still there. The Park Service has rebuilt it at least once, and it's nowhere near the height that's shown in this wartime drawing. Burnside, obstinate as he is, decides to attack. So beginning in early afternoon on Saturday, December 13th, 1862, the Union regiments, brigades, and divisions go up that long slope. And just as they're moving up, the Confederates just as steadily mow them down. And Chamberlain and his comrades watch from across the river as the attacks are just destroyed. Fifth Corps gets the order to move late across the river, and towards sunset comes out of the ruins of Fredericksburg, forms and makes a charge. The 20th Maine reaches the highest point that the Unions can attain. Is considered to be a little brow on the hill, a little crest. Chamberlain writes that the 20th Maine got up there, traded a few volleys as the darkness settled in. He gets hit for the first time. He and Ames went up without their horses. Chamberlain is nicked by a bullet in his earlobe that also just lightly touches his neck. Another inch or two closer into his skin, and they're probably been all over for him. He and the regiment stay out on the body-strewn slopes of Maurice Heights until finally withdrawing on Monday, December 15th. Chamberlain stays in the Army. He has a goal of seeking higher command. He would love the colonelcy of the 20th Maine. And Adelbert Ames actually gives him that opportunity during the Battle of Chancellorsville. Ames leaps to become an aide at staff level, and he will get his brigadier general star. The 20th Maine will go into smallpox quarantine. We're talking about COVID right now. The 20th Maine boys were supposed to be inoculated with cowpox, and they got inoculated with smallpox, and would have ended up sitting out the Battle of Chancellorsville, but Chamberlain convinces high command, put us in if we can only do nothing more than give the Confederate smallpox, and the 20th Maine will spend the battle guarding the Union telegraph lines. When Robert E. Lee invades Pennsylvania afterwards, 5th Corps and their Army of the Potomac goes after him. On the march north in late June, Chamberlain receives a notification that he's officially a colonel. He also has contracted malaria. Sunstroke drops him dead, almost dead in his tracks for 4 days, just before the cavalry fights at Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville. But he recovers, and though he does not feel well, takes the 20th Maine, which is assigned to Strong Vincent's brigade of 5th Corps, all the way to Gettysburg in a series of long marches. And on the afternoon of Thursday, July 2nd, when James Longstreet launches his right wing attack against the Union left, Vincent ends up taking his brigade up Little Round Top under Confederate artillery fire and deploys his 4 regiments. The 20th Maine ends up at the southern end of Little Round Top. Shortly before the Alabamians, particularly the 47th and the 15th Alabama of William S. Oates, arrive. There is discussion that if Oates had not diverted up Big Round Top after the U.S. 2nd sharpshooters that were causing casualties on his advancing regiments, that he might have arrived at Little Round Top in time to have been up on it before Vincent deployed his brigade. Times, as remembered by participants in this battle, vary by the individual, so it's a little bit hard to say. The fighting is savage. Chamberlain swings his line back into a V. You can see it in the center of the map. Company F at the nexus of the V is his color company, and the 20th Maine Monument on Little Round Top, which we can see its western slope from the upper left photo, is supposedly where the colors were placed, the regimental colors were placed during the fights. In a time frame varying anywhere from 1 hour to 2 hours, depending on who's doing the estimating, the Mainers and Alabamians fight savagely, and Chamberlain, who is known, sees about 1/3 of his men are down. He can count the bodies, and he knows they're running out of ammunition. His boys are telling him that. He orders a charge, and he swings the left wing to the south. As it comes to even with the color company and the right wing, they continue swinging all the way around, and basically until they get out a little bit in front of the 83rd Pennsylvania. Capture many Alabamians, others get away, but basically it seals the fate of the Union left flank in ensuring that the Confederates cannot get past Little Round Top and get deeper into the Union Army's backyard out on the Taneytown Road where the wagon trains have been kept. Chamberlain's hit twice, one in his right instep, and sometime during the battle, he's suddenly struck on his left hip and knocked down. But instead of having a hole in his hip, he discovers that his sword scabbard has a big ding in it. He can never draw the sword again. And that sword and the scabbard with that big ding in it are now on display at the Thomas Hill House in Bangor, which is operated by the Bangor Historical Society. Chamberlain's horse is safely away from the battle, so this time at least he does not get one shot. Chamberlain, even though he's still suffering from malaria, stays with the 1st Division as far as Williamsport, and the confirmation that Robert E. Lee has successfully withdrawn his army over the Potomac River. Shortly afterwards, Chamberlain files for a 15-day medical leave of absence. It's granted. He comes up to Washington, D.C., recovers for a while, and then returns to the war. This will become a habit of his. When he's feeling his worst, he insists on returning. He rejoins the 1st Division, and Charles Griffin, who's the gentleman portrayed on the right here, likes Chamberlain. Like Adelbert Ames, he sees something in this colonel that, again, remains a bit ill-defined. So he places Chamberlain temporarily in command of the 3rd Brigade. And as such, Chamberlain and the 3rd Brigade are on the lines outside Rappahannock Station on November 7th, 1863. Railroad track separates 5th Corps from the next Army Corps to the west. That's the corps that will actually make the nighttime attack against Lee's defenses. Ironically, the 20th Maine is on the right of Chamberlain's brigade out next to the railroad track. The 6th Maine Infantry is on the opposite side of the track. As Mainers will do, when we find each other out of state, we'll start talking. And when the 6th Maine boys start the charge after dark against the Confederate defenses at Rappahannock Station, Captain Walter Morrill and a pile of the 20th Maine boys say, we're in, and they participate in it too. And even though Chamberlain does not admit that he fights at Rappahannock Station, he does note that his horse, Charlemagne, gets shot and wounded. Charlemagne is actually a Confederate horse captured by the Union, apparently in September, maybe early October, 1863, and for some reason had been used as a pack horse. Chamberlain paid the Army $150 for Charlemagne, made sure he got groomed and fed well, and kind of became a interspecies love affair, shall we say. Charlemagne really liked Chamberlain, and Chamberlain, he really liked Charlemagne. The two almost became one by the time of the Appomattox campaign. Malaria almost kills Chamberlain, so he goes home to recover. And because he's in such bad shape and the malaria just keeps flaring up, the Army assigns him to court-martial duty in Washington, D.C. and New Jersey during winter 1863, 1864. Fanny comes down and spends quite a bit of time with him. She will return home to Brunswick and the two children in the spring. Chamberlain insists on lobbying the War Department in April, put me back on the field. So he's granted his wish, and he ends up back with 5th Corps at outside Spotsylvania Courthouse on May 17th, 1864. The next day, he's laying out under Confederate artillery fire, and he's writing a letter to the Maine governor, basically expressing his excitement at being back in the field, and he hopefully will stay in as long as he can. Griffin's got to find a brigade for Chamberlain to command, so he gives him the 1st Brigade on June 6th during the Cold Harbor debacle for the Union. And Chamberlain whips the brigade into shape, takes it during the Army's sidestep down across the peninsula, across the James River into Petersburg. So 42 days after arriving back with the Army, Chamberlain now lies dying in a 1st Division field hospital outside Petersburg. He knows he's going to die. He writes about the sudden pain that hits him. But out of the dark comes his youngest brother, Tom, who's the upper right photo. This is the much maligned Thomas Chamberlain, whom history has treated poorly. I have different thoughts about this young man, but he's brought with him Ellis Spear, who's portrayed in the lower right, who had commanded the left flank of the 20th Maine at Little Round Top and was Joshua Chamberlain's friend. And Tom's also brought 2 surgeons with him, Dr. Abner Shaw of the 20th Maine and Dr. Morris Townsend of the 44th New York, which is also brigaded with the 20th Maine. The 2 doctors start working on Chamberlain. He's bleeding out through his holes. And what they're trying to do is to find the severed blood vessels and tie them off, especially the ones obviously on the discharge side of the heart. They reach a point where there's one blood vessel that refuses to be caught in the, I guess it must be forceps. Townsend wants to stop. Shaw says, let me try one more time. This doesn't work. Well, the colonel's going to die. Shaw finds a blood vessel, ties it off, and Chamberlain lives to see the next dawn. Meanwhile, Governor K. Warren notifies Ulysses Simpson Grant that Chamberlain had expressed the desire to become a brigadier general. He has been in command of a brigade for some months now, and he more than deserves the star. So Grant issues an order promoting Chamberlain, quote, on the spot. In the left photo here is the highway marker that the state of Virginia relocated several years ago to a better approximate spot of where Chamberlain was hit on June 18th. This is actually very near the Taylor Creek and what would have been the Confederate defenses on the other side of it. Chamberlain survives. He's taken by hospital transport to the War Department Hospital at Annapolis. His wife comes down with one of her woman friends, helps care for him. And ultimately, Chamberlain goes home. He is essentially incontinent because of what's happened. Is that very early in his recovery, a surgeon put a silver tube into him, hoping that it would drain the urine naturally from his bladder. But the tube was left in too long and has formed what's called a fistula. When the tube's taken out, instead of urinating normally, Chamberlain's leaking urine out through this fistula. But he survives, and he returns to the Army in November, participates in the raid that tears up 20 miles of Weldon Railroad. Chamberlain leaves a very detailed account of that particular campaign in a letter written to his sister Sally. But he realizes, I can't do this. He goes home. Ultimately, he will travel to Philadelphia for a surgery done by Dr. Joseph Pancoast. He is probably America's most renowned urologist at a time when we all have a pretty good idea of what the state of medicine was, at least in terms of infection control in the United States. Pancoast performs the surgery. Chamberlain again will go home. And in February 1865, he's offered a position as the collector of customs at in the seaport of Bath, which is 10 miles east of Brunswick. It's a nice, cushy federal position. You wouldn't even have to show up 5 days a week. It would be difficult traveling there 5 days a week in a typical Maine winter, at least in 1865. But Chamberlain, in a angry letter writing campaign with his parents, and the tempers are flying both ways, even though the anger is kind of being kept dampened. He tells them, I've got to go back to the war. And his mother and father are telling him that, to paraphrase it, you're nuts. Why do so? We're not sure what Fanny thinks. Her husband's home. He has $1 million wound. He can accept a medical discharge, and he will always be known as General Chamberlain. He will never be known as the Colonel Chamberlain. He will be known for the rest of his life as the General. Chamberlain insists on going back. Part of it is that patriotism. Part of it is his ambition. One of his letters he writes, he says, I'm the most senior officer in my grade. I'm assuming he must mean either in the division or 5th Corps, and he does not want someone else to command 1st Division. So back he goes, arriving in late winter, just in time to participate in the beginning of the Appomattox campaign. Phil Sheridan and his cavalry are going to be thrown by Grant out to the far Union left, basically to turn Robert E. Lee's right flank, which extends far west of Petersburg now. But the cavalry cannot carry that flank alone and ride up and cut the South Side Railroad and hold it, particularly with Confederate infantry nearby. So Grant orders out 5th Corps, commanded by Warren. He's the gentleman depicted here. So on March 29th, 1865, 5th Corps comes out of its camps and marches into Dinwiddie County, heading southwest towards Dinwiddie Courthouse. It's a small village built around the ramshackle courthouse. Chamberlain's brigade is leading and gets within a few miles of the courthouse when Meade or Grant decides, well, 2nd Corps, which is up a little bit to the north and east of 5th Corps and is moving more directly west, well, they might get in trouble with the Confederates that are in those entrenchments along White Oak Road. So 5th Corps needs to go back up and help out 2nd Corps, which is really in no danger yet. Chamberlain turns around, marches back up the highway, turns up the Quaker Road, and heads due north towards White Oak Road. He crosses Gravelly Run. That's the stream that's depicted down low. And hits the straight section of the Quaker Road through this area here, which is Lewis Farm. As the Union troops are marching north, Robert E. Lee has ordered out his Confederate infantry along those White Oak Road defenses to find the Union infantry. What is going on south of you guys? The Yankees and the Confederates collide right here. The Confederates will be coming out of the tree lines. The Yankees will be pushing north. The fighting is savage on both sides of the road. I consider the short time here during the Battle of Lewis Farm perhaps be Chamberlain's finest offensive moment of the war, but again, it's my opinion. What happens is that he leads his brigade in a charge, as he calls it, straight up the road. Charlemagne, his horses that are accustomed to war are wont to do, gets a little excited, gets moving too fast. When Chamberlain hauls on the reins and Charlemagne stands up in his rear hooves, the bullet intended for the general punches through the horse's neck. And according to how Chamberlain describes it, kind of rips along the inner edge of his left arm, apparently must come arcing out at his bent elbow, strikes a leather case that Chamberlain has in his left breast pocket. He's got paperwork, folded orders, and something else in there. The bullet is deflected by the case, follows his rib cage around underneath his coat, comes out the backside of his coat, and then strikes the holstered pistol of the lieutenant riding with Chamberlain. The bullet destroys the pistol and knocks the lieutenant from the horse. Charlemagne sprays blood all over Chamberlain. Griffin rides up. He thinks Chamberlain is mortally wounded because there's blood everywhere. But Chamberlain is not that seriously wounded, and he stays with the brigade for the rest of the fight and is actually involved in some pretty close in fighting on the left side of the road. And of course, poor Charlemagne is kind of a little bit worse for wear. On March 30th, the rains fall very heavily. Grant and Meade order Sheridan and Warren, don't move. The roads are flooding in Dinwiddie County. Apparently, Robert E. Lee didn't get that directive because he orders his cavalry, including units that are coming from the Richmond area, to move all the way around behind the Petersburg trenches, gather at Five Forks, which is a few miles west of the end of his regular defenses. And he also moves some of his infantry, including George Pickett's division, over to Five Forks. On March 31st, Warren gets the orders to probe north, see if you can put a lodgment on White Oak Road. So he starts his division north, the 2nd and 3rd Division in the lead, and the Confederates who are in the White Oak Road earthworks, and you can see them in the two photos here. This is an area that's been purchased and preserved by the American Battlefield Trust on the White Oak Road. Confederates come boiling out because they can see the Yankees coming, and they essentially ambush the lead elements, and they drive the 2nd and 3rd Division back on the 1st Division. Griffin and Warren call upon Chamberlain and his brigade to help bail out the situation. The entire 5th Corps moves forward. There is some messy fighting, but at the end of the day, 5th Corps has crossed White Oak Road, is now holding about 300 yards of it west of the Confederate defenses. They have fulfilled Grant's directive. Unfortunately, as the evening comes on, the fighting here has died down. And Chamberlain and Warren, as they're dismounting, they can hear shooting to the southwest. They had expected Sheridan to come up on their left flank. They can quickly figure out that the shooting is receding. Sheridan's in trouble. And even before receiving the official order from Grant, Warren starts at least one of his divisions down to Dinwiddie Courthouse to help Sheridan. But the order comes for 5th Corps to completely withdraw from White Oak Road. And Chamberlain expresses his anger at 1,500 men shot dead or wounded for nothing at all. Next day, April 1st, Sheridan has command of both the Cavalry Corps and 5th Corps, leads them both north to attack the Confederate defenses along White Oak Road and at Five Corners. The photo in the upper right, I'm standing in the middle of White Oak Road looking east. You can see the other 3 roads that comprise this 5-way intersection. Confederates had built earthworks along the left side of the road, and those extended some distance eastward. Union infantry hit the far end of the Confederate defenses. Actually, it's one of Warren's divisions missed them altogether and wandered off to the north quite a ways before realizing, oh, they're shooting the south of us, so we need to turn back to the southwest, see what's happening. Of course, George Pickett is enjoying his shad bake. Chamberlain is in the midst of the fight, doesn't get shot this time. And the battle ends in essentially the Union troops rolling up the Confederate defenses, capturing quite a few Confederate defenders, and opening the way to the South Side Railroad. But for Chamberlain, this fight brings a deep personal tragedy. The gentleman on the right photo is named Fred Winthrop. He's also Brigadier General. He commands a 5th Corps brigade. He and Chamberlain are good friends. Shortly before the 5th Corps attacks, Winthrop rides up to Chamberlain and asks, "Do you have some food you could share with me? I haven't eaten." They get the impression for about a day or so. So the 2 generals sit on a log and share what I think was probably coffee and hardtack. Winthrop rides off to join his brigade, and during the attack, while plowing into the Confederate lines, he is mortally wounded. With the cutting of the South Side Railroad by Sheridan's troops on April 2nd, and also the successful breakthrough outside Petersburg by other Union infantry, Lee pulls all his men out of the defenses of Richmond south of Petersburg. He's heading west. The Yankees are in pursuit. Lee tried to turn at one point, of course, to move south in North Carolina to join Joe Johnston, but bounced off 2 or 3 Union Corps that got to that spot ahead of him. So he's moving further west now towards Lynchburg. Sheridan is driving his cavalry. Grant and Meade are driving the infantry. And the Yankees basically in the end will outmarch Lee and his hungry, worn out soldiers. And early on the morning of Sunday, April 9th, which is actually a Palm Sunday, Chamberlain beds down with his brigade near Appomattox Station. A few hours later, Sheridan sends orders to the different infantry commanders. "You guys come up, my cavalry is in front of Lee, and if you get up and help us, we can put an end to this." The next morning, as the Union cavalry, just fighting dismounted as portrayed in the upper picture, slowly gives ground ahead of John Gordon's advancing Confederate infantry west of Appomattox Courthouse, Union infantry comes marching up, including white divisions, black divisions. As Chamberlain is coming up with 1st Brigade, he also has nominal command of 2nd Brigade. And Sheridan sends an aide to grab some infantry commander, happens to be Chamberlain. So Chamberlain peels 2 brigades off to the east to reinforce the Union cavalry, because Sheridan is afraid that Gordon may try to slip around his own left flank, push the cavalry aside, and still make a run for Lynchburg. The day will end, of course, with Lee surrendering his army to Grant. Chamberlain writes that about seeing the immaculately clad Lee ride up to the McLean house, and then Grant arriving with a few aides. Grant's uniform is all mud splattered because he'd ridden through the night on the rainy, muddy roads. And Grant was never one to really care what he looked like, at least in uniform anyways. Confederate cavalry, artillery surrenders. Chamberlain is given the honor of accepting the official surrender of the Confederate infantry. So on April 12th, he requests his old 3rd Brigade. So he's transferred to command that, but he's also given command effectively of the entire 1st Division. The map shows in blue there the three lines that shows how the three brigades of the 1st Division lined up from near the McLean house out to the edge of Appomattox Village, so that the Confederate infantry could come up from their camps on the other side of Appomattox River and surrender basically division by division and its components. The wartime drawing on the lower left shows Union troops on the right, and on the far left at Appomattox Courthouse, facing the Confederate troops in the middle. You can see a few already are moving around they're not carrying any weapons. They've stacked arms, they've left their flags and their ammunition, not haversacks, ammunition pouches, excuse me. And they will get their paperwork so they can now head on home unmolested by the federal authorities and hopefully by any remaining Confederate authorities. And then, of course, Chamberlain now has what he wanted, his dream command, what probably brought him back the most into the Army when he should have stayed home. He has now command of 1st Division, 5th Corps, takes it back to Richmond, the north to Arlington, Virginia, and in one last grand hurrah, he commands the division during the Monday, May 23rd, 1865, Grand Review of the Army of Potomac in Washington, D.C. This wartime photograph shows the Union cavalry coming up Pennsylvania Avenue. On the right, at the edge of the trees against the horizon, the dust almost obscures the Capitol dome. Chamberlain stays in the Army as long as he can. He actually considers a full-time regular Army career, but he realizes that there's no way that riding a horse and chasing the Cheyenne, Sioux, or Apaches, wherever the Army would send him to the American West or Southwest, there's no way he's going to survive that. He comes home from the war. The next year, the Maine Republican Party makes him their candidate for governor. He's elected to 4 simultaneous one-year terms as governor. He's the first person to be elected to 4 terms in a row as governor of Maine. Has to deal with some tricky situations, including in January 1880, an armed insurrection that erupts in Augusta and sees basically 2 armed mobs occupying the Maine State House. What has happened is that the gubernatorial election in autumn 1879, there was no clear winner, at least one side believes. So it's decided to obfuscate and delay the inauguration of the purported winner. The other side says, we're not going to tolerate this. And so they send in their armed backers. Chamberlain is called to the State House by the outgoing Maine governor. As commander of the Maine State Militia, Chamberlain tells his junior commanders, stay home unless I tell you that I need you and your men here. He and the Augusta City Police gradually clean the armed insurrectionists out of the State House. And ultimately, the Maine Supreme Court rules on the legality of the 1879 election. The winner is declared. He is inaugurated. Chamberlain signs off his last official paperwork and goes home. The war will go with him for the rest of his life. He will be reliving it through his writings. He becomes a very popular speaker at Maine regimental reunions, at GAR events, on both the Maine and New England level and on the national level. For some years, he becomes the president of Bowdoin College. It's the last job that will leave him really financially secure, at least in the far edge of the prime of his life. But his wound is still afflicting him. The malaria is too. He's prone to infections because the wound is just basically wearing down his immune system. He and Fanny do develop a troubled relationship. I'm looking at it from the outside in. I can see where the war has probably changed Chamberlain. I believe he's come home with PTSD. And in my opinion, one way he's dealing with it is by reliving the war, by attending the reunions, by his writings. He is a very good writer. And There are people that to this day, of course, dispute the accuracy of much of what he wrote. Fanny will die in 1905. Chamberlain by now is been named the surveyor of the port of Portland, which is Maine's largest city. So he moves there and buys a house at 499 Ocean Avenue. The house is still there, privately owned, and he will die there from his war wound on February 24th, 1914. And how do we know that he died from his war wound? Dr. Abner Shaw, the physician from the 20th Maine, who tied off that last bleeding severed blood vessel at Petersburg, is the physician who will examine Chamberlain and will record on Chamberlain's death certificate the different causes of death, and he'll make a notation of them that they were originally caused by a gunshot wound. So almost 50 years after he shot at Petersburg, Chamberlain finally dies of that particular wound. The book also, which has been published by Savas Beatty, also contains 3 very interesting appendices. The first one has several maps. It's titled Joshua L. Chamberlain Sites to Visit in Maine. If you get up this way, the Bangor Brewer area where I live, there are several interesting sites. The heart of Chamberlainville, as we would probably call it here in Maine, is in the Brunswick, which was basically once he left Brewer, he never went back. And so Brunswick became his hometown. There's quite a bit to see and do there. The Jeff Scott History Center maintains and operates the Chamberlain home as a museum. And it's an excellent museum. I toured it with my wife a few years ago. Definitely worth going to see. The second appendix, which is written by Ashley Toll, PhD, examines the complicated relationship of Joshua and Fanny. They did love each other, but there were issues. You need to buy the book and read the appendix to find out what they were. Then Ryan Quint has examined why Chamberlain? Why of all the regimental colonels, and there were so many hundreds that served during the Civil War, is Joshua Chamberlain the colonel that everyone remembers today, either for the good or the bad? There are Chamberlain admirers, there are Chamberlain detractors. I'm not going to delve into why Chamberlain is popular today. Again, you need to read Ryan's appendix to find that out. But of course, we all know there's a particular movie that came out in the 1990s, but I won't go into any details there. That's the end of my talk. Again, I'm Brian F. Swartz. I publish the Maine at War blog post every Wednesday morning. I've also published volume 1 of my Maine at War series. That book is titled Bladensburg to Sharpsburg. That's available at Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million also online. And I'm just wrapping up the writing of volume 2. And at this point, I'm happy to answer questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for that talk. And my cat has decided to be very needy at the moment, so I'm balancing her. She's had a surgery, so she's got a big ugly cone on her head too. But that was excellent, and I know we had some questions come in over the chat, so I'm going to get to those. And let's see what people are curious about. And I guess at the end, when you were talking about the appendices and the why Chamberlain, I'm curious to know, why did you choose to write about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain?
I was asked by Chris Mikowski, the head of Emerging Civil War.
Okay.
And I have provided a few guest blog posts for ECW. And in February 2019, he asked me if I would be interested in writing a biography of Joshua Chamberlain. I do know that Chris was not aware at that particular time that I had grown up on Chamberlain Street in Brewer. I do want to point out that Chamberlain Street in Brewer existed by 1862, not its full length. It was named for the Chamberlain family, not for the general. That's not one of his claims to fame. Chamberlain grew up he and I grew up no more than a mile apart.
Well, that's interesting.
For whatever it's worth. I mean,
Yeah. All right. So to the questions, Niels asked, when Chamberlain was given the group of mutineers from the 2nd Maine, did he really win them over through an emotional appeal of the kind that he gives in the film Gettysburg?
the emotional appeal in the film Gettysburg is fiction. Chamberlain took the mutineers, spread them between the different companies, his 10 companies. Ultimately, he had 6 that refused to do duty. Those 6 became 4, possibly 3. The movie shows that there were 3 at Gettysburg. Oh, wait a minute. No, it was 6, excuse me, that refused to do duty. 2 of them, at least at Gettysburg, perhaps a 3rd. So a bit of confusion at Chamberlain's placement of a comma in a report written a few days after Gettysburg as to whether or not the 3rd mutineer participated. Of the other 3, 1 went to prison, and 2 ultimately did end up back in federal military service. But he spread them between the companies. He treated them well. The mutineers had not been fed for about 48 hours, and hungry men are angry men, particularly when they're combat veterans. And he made sure immediately that they got fed a hot meal.
All right. So another question, this one is, can you discuss the post-war feud that Chamberlain had with William C. Oates, the commander of the 15th Alabama?
Yes, I can, because I just finished reading a book about that particular feud. Oates claimed that during his regiment's attack against the 20th Maine, his men got further up around the regiment. It's refused left flank. Perhaps the biggest controversy or the feud that was initiated between the 2 men was the idea that Chamberlain ordered the charge, the maneuvered his regiment into that right wheel, which meant his left flank had to come forward, line up with the right flank, and then move down to the south and then back to the west to sweep away the attacking Confederates. Oates claims that he had already ordered a withdrawal. He also claims that his men were being fired upon from behind them. That would have been Captain Walter Morrow's Company B, which had Chamberlain been thrown out on his left flank, and they were behind a stone wall. The controversy, I gotta be careful what I say here. There is confirmation both ways, but there is an eyewitness account provided by Ellis Spear that does describe Colonel Chamberlain as ordering a charge at the height of the battle. So the maneuver obviously took place, and Spear, in his report, which is actually a letter he mailed to Maine within a few days after the stand at Little Round Top, does detail what happened to the fighting, the night's assault on Big Round Top. And he also counts up all the prisoners they took and lists the 4 regiments. It's a dispute between Oates and Chamberlain that has its adherents of both sides and will never actually be fully answered. We don't know for sure, at least those of us on the Yankee side, if the Alabamians were actually withdrawing. I suspect that probably Oates is correct that he had ordered his men to start pulling out, but a lot of them did get caught during the withdrawal.
Thank you for that. And this is just kind of a refresher thing. Scott wants to know, oh wait, no, sorry. Claire wants to know, how many times in all was Chamberlain shot?
I've got to add this up a little bit. Once, 2, 3, 3 by Gettysburg, 4 by Petersburg, 5 at Lewis Farm, 5 times, I believe. I think he also had 5 horses get shot too. One of them was Charlemagne, at least, getting shot twice.
Yeah, that's a lot of times, it seems like.
Yep.
And Scott asked, why were there Chamberlain detractors? What's the reason for that?
There, in my research, and again, in my opinion, the original Chamberlain detraction started within the survivors of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment. By the 1880s, there's a certain first lieutenant, Holman Melcher of Company F, which was the color company at Little Round Top, is claiming that he's the one that started the charge. And in a book that's actually written later on about him, he basically wanted to take some men out and recover some wounded Yankees that the 20th Maine had pulled back. Melcher wanted to take some his comrades out and recover some wounded Mainers that were laying out beyond the line. Chamberlain deals with this request or effort by Melcher in his own memoirs. But according to Melcher, some of the men that were with him, Melcher just advances 10 paces, waves his sword and yells, "Come on, come on." And that part of the line just moves forward. And other men seeing, these other soldiers moving, and they're also hearing somebody yell advance or forward, they go with them. And Ellis Spear up on the far left flank, he sees that motion going forward. He claims years later that I received no orders to attack, even though Chamberlain in his memoirs claims that he went over to where Spear stood and the distance would not have been that great for walking, and told him what he needed him to do on the far left flank when the command came. Spear basically comes to believe that this is probably how the charge began. In time, Spear will find that Chamberlain's writings are embellished. He finds fault with Chamberlain's memories. He will write at least one small book refuting Chamberlain's memoirs of the Battle of Fredericksburg. But for Spear, actually, Emerging Civil War will be posting a blog post about this issue. I just finished it today and sent it sometime in the next few weeks. 1913, he publishes an account of the battle in which he claims that Melcher and his men were responsible for starting the charge. Never mentions Chamberlain at all. But again, actually within a few days after Little Round Top, in a letter written home, Spear says, quote, "The colonel ordered a charge," unquote, and then described what happened beyond that point. I suspect on Spear's part, there could have been, and part of others, there could have been some jealousy. Chamberlain was really what we would call a rock star among Union veterans until late in his life, when he became perhaps, I guess you'd say, too frail to go out and mingle with the aging survivors any longer. Again, that's my belief.
So the controversy is primarily over kind of what happened there at Little Round Top.
And since then, 150 odd years later or so, there have been historians, even to this day, that believe that, yes, Chamberlain embellished his writings. And there are some people, I guess you would call Chamberlain haters. He's not only the most popular colonel in American Civil War history, he's also perhaps the most hated colonel in American Civil War history, at least in 2021. At least that's the impression I get.
That's interesting, because I hadn't realized that there was so much controversy about him. Kind of going back to just his start, or at least in the war, Fernando wants to know, what was the reason that he was appointed as lieutenant colonel at the time of his recruitment?
It's an excellent question. And for Fernando, I can tell you that the Maine governor, Israel Washburn, never answered that. He had heard good news about Chamberlain. Unfortunately, well, actually, it wasn't unfortunately. The Bowdoin College faculty, when they found out that their full-time colleague was leaving to go into the Army, trash talked Chamberlain in a letter or two sent to the governor. Chamberlain's departure from Bowdoin would upset the political power balance between the faculty on one hand and the administration / trustees on the other. Also, the Maine Attorney General really vilified Chamberlain in a letter to the Governor Washburn. Washburn ignored all criticism. Other men had reported that Chamberlain was smart, qualified. That's why he was named lieutenant colonel. There was also the distinct possibility that Washburn had run out of other qualified combat veterans to give that position to.
All right. And I think one last question here, this from Scott. He asked, was Chamberlain a good politician? Elected 4 times in a row usually means something.
He was a good politician in terms of doing his duty. He was also so well known that in the state of Maine, again, he had kind of that rock star feel, at least in the state at that particular time, before he went national. He did the job well, but he developed many political enemies, including James G. Blaine, who was the demigod of the Maine Republican Party, who obviously went on to run for presidency sometime later. After he stepped down as governor, Chamberlain hoped the Maine State Senate would name him to fill a U.S. Senate vacancy, but Blaine instead interfered and helped deny Chamberlain that desire. So he was a good governor, a mediocre politician. He really did not have a politician's heart or skills. He had a warrior's heart and he had a soldier's skills. And that was far more needed in the 1860s, at least by the state of Maine, than another political hack was needed, in my opinion.
Interesting. And there's one question that I missed early on that I'll throw out as well. Pam wants to know if you could give us some quick thoughts about Tom Chamberlain.
Tom Chamberlain has been vilified in history as the little brother, mama's favorite child, maybe. That's one of those ideas that's been kicked around, that he got his position based on his brother being lieutenant colonel and then colonel. Tom Chamberlain, though, did advance on his own merits. He was a brave soldier, a capable soldier. He does not come across, at least through the war, as the slightly bumbling youngest brother as he's portrayed, at least pre-Gettysburg, pre-Little Round Top in the movie Gettysburg. After the war, Tom clearly suffered from PTSD. You won't see this concept put out there by most historians who even bother to look at him. He became an alcoholic. He married his brother John's widow. There were 4 Chamberlain brothers and a sister. 2 brothers, Horace and John, were basically killed by tuberculosis. John had only been married for a little while, so his widow, who knew Tom, they got married. Tom went into business. Supposedly, again, he became an alcoholic after the war, but this is not a rarity. Alcoholism was rampant, particularly among the senior Union general ranks at times during the war. And of course, in American society, it was as rampant then probably as drug abuse is today. Tom lived until I believe it was 1896. He was always somehow in his brother's shadow. And I think this is how he's been looked at among other aspects. He was a man in his own right. He was a very good soldier in his own right. And I have not found any indications yet, again, this is just me, that he was an abusive alcoholic, if he was an alcoholic. I hope that answers that question. That's a very good question, and thank you for asking it.
Well, and thank you for this very informative talk tonight. I feel like I learned a few new things and was definitely reminded of some things that I learned a ways back. So
Thank you.
This was excellent, very enjoyable.
Thank you so
And
much for having me here.
for anyone that wants the book, you can get it through the publisher, Savas Beatty, or also through our shop. And so 2 ways to get that book, probably many more ways to get it as well, but I'll throw those out. We do appreciate Savas Beatty and the great partnership we have with them. And I'll just end by saying good night to everyone. Thank you once again. And thank you to those of you that continue to log on for our book talks and continue to provide support. And if you want to think about becoming a member of the museum, that is always an option as well. And you can find information on our website about that. But thank you all so much. And again, thank you, Mr. Swartz. That was excellent.
Appreciate it.
And everybody have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.